Hi, Julia Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. As you know, I love 3D cookies, and I'm also pretty partial to my new Prettier Plaques stencil sets. So I was looking for a way to combine both 3D cookies and my stencils to create something unique for Mother's Day or for really any special occasion. And that was the inspiration behind this lovely 3D cookie box that you see in front of us. In addition to using both 3D cookies and my stencils, it also employs a number of piping techniques, royal icing rose transfers, various borders, and some interesting curved cookie shapes in the corners, and also a Franken-cookied cookie at the top. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by Franken-cookie in a bit. But first, let's talk about what we'll need for this project as far as cookies. This is basically a 13 cookie project with an optional 4 cookies for the feet of the box. You can do this box with or without the feet. We start with a base, which is about 5 3/4 inches square with the corners lopped off, and I'll be cutting that for you in a moment. This was cut with a custom template. Then you'll need 4 3.5 by 3.5 inch squares to form the sides of the box. And I'll have all the dimensions in the video description. In fact, that's the best place to check, because if I misstate something here, you'll get all the correct dimensions in the video description beneath the video player. I've got 4 fun curved cookie corners. They're going to be inset into the very edges of the box. And I'm going to show you how I make these pieces because they're a little bit unusual. Now, moving on to the lid itself, that's comprised of 4 pieces. Again, a custom cut square with some notches in the corner. It's cut very similarly to the base piece. On top of that, we're going to be putting a piece that mirrors that, which is actually cut with a cookie cutter from Cookie Cutter Kingdom. A 1.5 to 1 1/4 inch circle with a hole cut in the middle that's going to receive my Franken-cookied handle. And by Franken-cookie, just as a reminder, someone in the cookie world coined this term, and it's nothing more than the creation of a new shape by cutting off or joining standard cookie shapes together. In this case, I took a standard cookie shape and I cut it down to create this novel shape, and I will show that in a bit. And then lastly, the 4 optional pieces, also a Franken-cookie, are formed by using a plaque cutter and lopping off the edge. Now, these pieces are completely optional. The box looks just as beautiful without the feet, as you'll see in some of the pictures floating overhead. So that completes the cookies needed for this project. Again, 13 required pieces and 4 that are optional. There are a number of other tools that will be required along the way, and I'll introduce them as we go. But the most notable ones, of course, are my Prettier Plaques stencils for the side decoration of the boxes. We'll be using my I'm Yours background stencil, as well as my To Mom. This comes from another set, one of my Mother's Day set, to stencil the lettering on the little plaque on the front of the box. You'll of course need an airbrush, and then we'll have some royal icing transfers and other things that will come into play as we move forward. So let's talk about how to cut some of the more interesting shapes that go into this project. Many of them use custom templates. When I'm making 1 or 2 special occasion pieces like this box, it's relatively complex. It's more of a showpiece type of cookie. I'll usually work with custom templates for odd or unusual shapes rather than having a custom cutter made. It's just much more expedient. However, if I were going to do a lot of these in a production mode, then I'd want to invest in having cutters made for some of the templates that I'll be using today. Now, 3 of my cookies, the base, the under part of the lid, and the top part of the lid all look similar in shape. The top part of the lid was actually cut with a cutter. This is a Cookie Cutter Kingdom cutter, and I'll have the link in the video description, so there's nothing special about that. However, these pieces are pretty large, 5.5 inches square and 5 3/4 inches square. Again, the dimensions will be in the video description. These are a little bit unusual, and this is where the custom template came into play. I'm just going to show you how to cut the bottom of the lid. The base gets cut exactly the same way. I've rolled my gingerbread dough about 3/16 of an inch thick, and the gingerbread recipe will be in the video description. So simply place the template on top. Don't press it in very much, or it can stick to the dough, and then take a sharp paring knife. And I find that one long stroke generally tends to create nice, cleaner edges rather than chopping up and down. Then pull off the excess dough. So for those notches, I actually took a round cutter. This is about 1¼ inches, and I cut in about 5/8 of an inch from the edge. You could actually mark off little guides to make sure you go in exactly the same distance on each corner, but I'm just going to eyeball it for purposes of today. And that's basically how you create the bottom part of the lid as well as the base of the box. So as you'll notice, I'm cutting directly on my silicone baking mat. This is done on purpose so that I can lift up the mat and put it directly on my baking sheet without having to lift the cookie dough itself and possibly misshaping it. And that's really key for making pieces that need to be tight fitting and put together very precisely like this box. Now I want to show you how to make this curved piece, which is rather novel. And these are going to go into the corners of the box. Here I am going to have to lift the piece because I am going to be shaping it over a cylinder. So I want to make sure the underside of the dough is well floured and that the dough is able to lift off the silicone baking mat at all times. And to do that, I sometimes take a ruler or spatula and just make sure it goes underneath it before I cut it and the dough disengages. This is a rectangular template, again, dimensions in the video description. Make sure your blade is clean so that you don't get a rough edge. If there's anything stuck to it, the cut will be rather rough. Remove the excess, lift off the template, and then we're going to shape this over a stainless steel tube. This is 1¼ inches in diameter. I actually got this in my hardware store and sanitized it. And to keep it from rolling around, I will actually nestle it between these little silicone molds, or you could nestle it in foil on your baking mat, on your baking sheet, so that it doesn't roll around in the oven. And then we want to lift this off without misshaping it as best as possible. Put it directly on the pipe. And if it did stretch at all, just reshape it. And then this will go directly in the oven, bake at my normal baking temperature, 375 for about 10 minutes. And when it's done, the only thing you want to do when it's still hot from the oven is take a thin bladed paring knife and run it under all the edges and make sure the piece is freely rotating on the tube. If you let it cool completely on the tube, it may stick and you may not be able to get it off, but when it's all done, it'll look something like this. Okay, so the handle, let's talk about this. It's kind of unique. I do have it baked onto a stick, so that's to provide a little extra support when I come to the assembly process. Not required, but it just gives a little more stability to the project in the end, and I do bake that in to the raw dough. So I'm going to show you how to do that. This is again a Franken cookie, meaning that I've taken a conventional shape and I'm changing it in some way. In this case, I'm actually cutting away from it to create a more tapered shape towards the bottom. In this particular cutter, again, the link will be in the video description. And I think I cut it about halfway up, just knocking off these side pieces like so. Take off the second side, and then in this case, you don't want to move it off the baking sheet. You just want to slip in a bamboo skewer into the side of the dough when it's on the sheet. And I only put it in about maybe 1/4 inch. We'll cut off the excess later, and this goes directly in the oven and bakes. It's baking for 10 minutes, not long enough at high enough temperature to burn the wood, so there's no need to worry about that. Lift it up, goes directly on your baking sheet. One of the other unusual pieces is this little ring. This is actually going to be used to keep the handle stable when we assemble it. And I simply cut that with a round cutter. I'm going to use a slightly larger one in this case, about 1½ inches. With a round cutter, with the dough still encircling it, I'll then take the end of about 1/4 inch tip to cut a hole out of the center to receive the stick in the end. And then remove the dough from the outside. And the last unusual piece is the foot for the box. Again, these are optional. And these two are a Franken cookie. I've used a standard plaque cutter and I've just cut away a portion of it so that when I put it together, the feet can all fit underneath the box. Otherwise, they'd hit each other. Now, when I would be baking this for real and not for demonstration purposes, I would bake like-sized cookies on the same cookie sheet, probably not the small one and this big one together. I'd have 4 of these to bake too, so I'd try to get them all on a single cookie sheet. And you'll see I just lopped it about so to allow for clearance underneath the box to fit all of the feet. So let's talk about preparing the sides of the box, which truly are the most decorative element of this particular project. They're going to go from plain naked like so to something that's airbrushed and floral. Here's a pink version of it. We're going to do a tan version of it, along with some shiny edges. So my first step before doing anything is to file these so they're perfectly square. I use a relatively non-spreading dough, but even so, some fine touches are required. I'll usually sand all four, or file, in this case using my microplaner, side by side to make sure that they're all the exact same height and fitting together very nicely. This is the basic process. If you don't have a microplaner, you can use sanding paper, but this is not food grade, so you'd have to be only using this box for show, and this is the motion in that case. So sand up the edges. The next step is to dust off the crumbs, and then take some edible luster spray. I use PME gold on my tan box and silver, or rather pearl, PME pearl, on my pink box that you just saw here, and spray all the edges. I'm not going to do that here because it gets everywhere, but you're looking for the edge to go from brown to gold in this case, something like so. Then outline and flood with tan icing in the case of the box I'm putting together. I also have a light pink version. You can do this in any range of color combinations and it's going to look beautiful. Now, once the icing is completely set, it's time to airbrush. You don't want to be airbrushing when the icing's too soft because you will be applying some pressure to it. As I mentioned before, I'm going to use the background from my I'm Yours set. All my backgrounds and message stencils and frame stencils in these sets are fully interchangeable. I should also point out before we start airbrushing that I actually stagger the patterns on each of the successive box sides. Again, this is a pink box that I'm going to be putting together a bit later. So I have flowers anchored to one side of the first side. I have them anchored to the opposite side of the second side, and so on and so forth down the line. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4. And that just makes for more interest as you look around the box so that you don't have all flowers continuously lined up or all the pieces going in the same direction. So that's how I'm going to lay my stencil down. So we're going to use this without the message and just the background. I am using a Stencil Genie, this pink frame, to kind of weigh it down. The key is that it sits flush against the cookie at all times. And I want that top flower showing, so I'm going to bring it down a bit to the edge of the frame. So I've got a light green in here. It's a mixture of my spring green and yellow. I want a really vibrant green for the center of the leaves. There will be some brown washing over it later, so it will tend to dull it out. I always like to test it on my paper towel first before I go directly on the cookie. That looks good. We're going to hit the centers of some of the leaves, and some of the leaves in their entirety. I like to work at pretty close range and fully from overhead so that I don't get less underspray under the stencil itself. Hit this little area. I am going to go ahead and put my next color in, which is purple. I've got a little residual green in there, so I may have to spray through to release all the green before I get to the true color of purple, unless I were to clean the gun out in between, but I'm not going to do that. So it's still coming out green. Now it's kind of brown, mixture of purple and green, and I'm going to just keep pushing it out until I get my bright color purple coming out. And I'm just going to hit the centers of the flowers with the purple. So my last color is brown. You'll notice I did splatter a little on my stencil as I was cleaning out the purple, and I've got these won't matter because they're not in any openings, but the spots there and there could potentially show. The good news is I'm going over with a dark brown, so hopefully I'll be able to cover most of that. So I'm doing all the outer petals, any parts of the exposed leaves that I didn't hit last time, the outer edges of them, and all the small dots to the right are going to be in brown. I think that looks pretty good. Let's see what it looks like. Ta-da! So we're going to set that aside, and I'm going to go ahead, keep my stenciling apparatus out, and stencil a little plaque, a little message plaque, something similar to this, to go in the center of that cookie. I'm going to use brown since I've got brown out, and then we'll choose whether we want to use brown or purple on the actual cookie. Now, these are nothing more than royal icing transfers, loose royal icing that's piped onto acetate. I traced an oval and then piped the icing to conform to that. I am going to leave it stuck on the acetate until I'm done stenciling. So here I'm using another stencil on the transfer from one of my recent Mother's Day sets. It's actually my March stencil of the month. So you might want to check that out on the stencilease.com site. And this is such a small piece, I don't really need that stencil frame to hold it down, but I do like to have the stencil lying as flat against the transfer as possible. So I use little weights to do that. These are actually magnets. There's no reason for the magnetization here because I don't have a magnetic countertop. They're just serving as weights to keep that stencil lying really flat. And I try to put them as close to the letters as possible so it's flattest, closest to where I'm airbrushing. And we're just going to use the brown I had in here previously, coming directly from overhead. I think that looks pretty good. And it sure does. And at this point, it's safer to remove this from the acetate just because the piece is less likely to slide around. Now this oval is a little misshapen relative to the one that has purple on it. And I like the fact that the purple on this particular transfer is brighter, whereas the purple on the cookie isn't. So I'm going to use this one to decorate the cookie out itself. As I said, I think I'm going to use the purple plaque because it's a little more vibrant, and I'm only putting it on the front face of the box. All the other sides are just going to be plainly stenciled like so. So to stick that down, I just want to put a little bit of royal icing glue. This is thick icing. The thicker the icing is, the faster it dries. And I'm going to anchor it a little bit. I don't want to cover the flower, but I want to anchor it a little bit higher than center so that when it stands upright, it's not too close to the bottom of the box. It'll look something like so. Okay, and now for details, I'm going to do some tiny brown dots around the plaque and also some bigger dots around the top and sides of the piece, but not at the bottom because we're going to be later putting another border on the bottom. So very small here, barely touching down with the icing. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now we're going to open up the cone a little bit more, just so I can get some larger dots around the edges of the cookie. You could finish the sides in any way. I want this box to look pretty streamlined, so simple dots are all I think I really need. And I'm leaving the bottom again clear because I'm going to have another bigger border down there later, which we'll put on once we have the box completely assembled. And that completes the dot work on this particular piece. One last touch I want to put on at this point to allow some drying time is a royal icing rose, which I think I'm going to anchor in the upper right, simply because my dots here aren't quite as uniform as they are everywhere else. I often say that cookie decorating is the art of masking errors. And I'm going to stick that down again with a little bit of white royal icing glue. The thicker it is, the faster it's going to dry, and we'll later come back in with some green leaves to fill in around it once we get this assembled. But I like to do that when the piece is actually standing upright because it's easier for me to see where to put the leaves in its final orientation. So we've airbrushed the four sides and we've put a plaque, a Tumam plaque and a rose on the front facing side. Now we're going to turn to the corners while those pieces are drying and decorate those. They're curved, so of course they're a little harder to flood with royal icing. I suppose you could, but for expediency's sake, I'm just going to cover them with fondant. So they're going to go from plain naked to something looking like this with fondant and a few brown lines as embellishments. First, of course, we want to spray it as we did with all the pieces with PME luster spray, so the edges, the tops and the bottoms, anything that's going to be exposed is gold and shimmery. So we're going to be working with this piece that I already sprayed because spraying makes rather a mess. You can refer to any number of my other videos though where I do spraying. Now for the fondant piece, I've simply rolled out a ribbon of fondant to the number 3 setting on my pasta machine, and I've got a whole ribbon making video that talks about how to roll out fondant. And I cut it into a rectangle using the same template used to cut the cookie. Remember this piece here, this acetate template? And we're just going to sit that onto the inside, the concave side of the cookie. And to do that, I'm going to glue it down with a little bit of corn syrup rather than thick royal icing, because the corn syrup will be sticky but a lot flatter, so I'm less likely to see lumps under thin sheets of fondant when I use corn syrup. And then hopefully take this piece, center it on the top, and then just take my finger and press uniformly so that it covers the whole thing evenly. And that's all there is to fitting it with fondant. I am going to now move it onto a non-skid surface because I am going to pipe those 3 lines down. Now back to my brown icing, but I'm doing lines, so this time I'm using an icing of outlining consistency, so it holds a nice tight line without spreading too much when it hits the surface. And I always like to pipe on my work surface first. To make sure you get the line straight down this, I sometimes like to take my trussing needle and just lie it in the center and gently press the top and the bottom into the fondant so I have kind of a scored mark to follow for the first line. That will assure me of going straighter. And I'm just going to put 2 more lines, one on either side of the center line. I'm piping pretty slow because I don't want the line to break. Clean that up, and I'm going to turn it around to get the line on the other side. It's just easier for me to see it without my hand being in the way. And just eyeballing it to make sure it's roughly the same distance from the from the center line as the other one was. And that's the basic finished piece. You of course want to do that 3 more times for all 4 corners and let those dry completely before we assemble it. So while the sides and corners are drying, I'm going to work on finishing off the decorating of the lid and the assembly process of it. So here's the base of the lid. As you recall, it started naked. I just want to talk you through, I've already started it, what I've done. I outlined and flooded the long sides in white and the corners in the same ivory color that the sides are, and then added just some simple line and dot details, mostly towards the outer edge, because this corner cut plaque piece that we airbrushed exactly the same way the sides are, is going to go on top. So again, there was no need really to ice in the interior because that's all going to be covered anyway. So right now I just want to focus on getting the additional line work and dot work down on this piece and also on this piece, and then we'll talk about the handle parts and start putting it all together. So I'm back to my brown outlining icing, and I just want to lay the line down here like I did on all the others. I want a slightly thinner line than what I had in the corners of the boxes, just because they're pretty thin already on this lid. So I put my icing in a new bag, and I'm just going to cut a slightly smaller opening, touching down, and I'm piping pretty slowly because I don't want to break this line on the white icing. It would be hard to clean up. Looks pretty good, a little crooked at the end there, but we're not going to worry about that. I need 3 tiny lines down the corner too. Now I'm back with my beadwork icing, and I'm going to do tiny dots, smaller dots along this edge here. So those dots look pretty good. Now I've got all my small dots done, so I'm ready to open up the tip a little bit, and we're going to come in with dots through here. Going down the side. I have to space these a little further apart because my icing's a little loose and they're spreading into each other. And that completes the detail on the box bottom. I want to move over and just do some simple dot work along these long edges of the airbrush piece that's going to go on top. I'm not going to put anything in the corners because we're going to have roses there, as you'll see. That's all the detail I'm going to do on that center piece. I'm just going to set that aside and talk a little bit about how I got the handle pieces from A to B. Basically, I started by outlining and flooding in tan and then a teardrop in white. I let the tan completely dry, then I added the white and let it completely dry. In these narrow areas, the icing tends to sink in the middle, which can be prevented by putting this to dry, quick dry in a dehydrator. But if you don't, no biggie, because I just piped some lines down through the center of it and that kind of conceals it. So again, using my outlining icing, pipe 3 lines down the center, 2 to the side, and all the other details were done with beadwork icing. Again, the relatively loose consistency icing. Tiny little dots around the white and then heavier ones here. Similarly, outlining icing for the lines and beadwork icing for the beads for these pieces. And then they're allowed to completely dry before we put them together, which we're going to do momentarily. So when all the dots and lines are dry to the touch, we are ready to assemble. I'm using my thick white royal icing glue. The thicker it is, the faster things will dry. And I'm just going to load a bunch into the center here where we're going to place that airbrushed plaque. And taking care not to smush any dots because mine hasn't dried altogether too long. I am going to center this on top. It's nice to look at it from overhead too to make sure it's centered in the piece underneath it. And if not, I can move it a little bit forward from the corners. I'm just going to leave that the way it is. And now we're going to glue down the next piece, which is simply the round disc that's more or less the receptacle for the handle. Now we're ready to put the topper in, and you have the option of angling it towards the corner, which is what I did on that box, or you can angle it towards one side, and I think I'm going to just angle it to one side here. And we are going to anchor it in place with a little bit of fondant in that hole. And that should allow it to stick upright without propping a lot sooner than if I didn't put fondant in that hole. So we're going to start with a little glue, tuck a little fondant in there to hold the stem in place, and then I'm going to put a little more glue on the end of the stick. And then just plunge it down. And at this point, you also want to look at it from every direction to make sure it's not leaning front to back or side to side. And I think that looks pretty good. Normally, I'd let that dry at least 15 minutes to half an hour before moving on to the next step, which is applying flowers. That way, that won't be so wobbly. But we're going to start applying flowers at the bottom, and hopefully by the time we get to the top, I'll be able to secure that seam, or hide that seam rather, with some small flowers. I've got some small royal icing roses. I have a whole nother video about how I made these. These are also royal icing transfers of a different sort, and they're just going to conceal these little corners here. So I want to make sure I choose ones that are relatively the same size before I do that, and I think that looks pretty good. And down they go. You could use white glue or green glue because we're going to be piping leaves around here momentarily. But white's always safe because if you misplace something, it's easier to clean off your piece than something that's tinted. And as this is drying, I can reorient it if needed so that it's straighter up. They've got a little bit of time before it's completely dry to play with that. Okay, so now I'm going to come in with some thick green icing to make leaves, and I've got a number 350 tip in here. 349 could also work well, and a relatively stiff icing that holds its shape. And I'm just going to pipe some small leaves in and around underneath to kind of hide these gaps. We're going to do that all the way around. Okay, and I think this is probably stable enough for me to now apply some tiny rosebuds down there to hide that seam. I want to be able to see into the rose in the final assembly, so I've kind of glued it on its side to the piece rather than on the flat of the rose. If that makes sense. And that's it. I think we've got enough leaves on that. I'm going to set that aside to dry, and we're going to now move on to assembling the bottom and putting it all together. So the bottom of the box is a rather long assembly process. You need to be patient and allow adequate drying time between various steps. So I've gotten a bit of a head start on you. I've got 3 of the sides already mounted, and I am going to be putting the side that we decorated earlier on to show you how to do that. But first, let me explain how these pieces have been mounted. You can see the side without the dots has been mounted down because I'm going to be putting another border there. And I stick them down with thick white royal icing glue, which you can see from the inside. The box is going to be lined with paper or a napkin before filling it with other cookies and things. So I'm not really concerned about seeing all that glue. But I prop both from the inside with whatever you can find. These are little coloring containers, and also from the outside by plunging skewers in here. And we just want to make sure all the sides are standing perfectly straight up and are also centered more or less on the side, on their side. So there's going to be a little gap here, which is fine because we're going to be covering some of this corner with roses. So these are already dry. I could remove all these supports if I wanted to, but I'm going to leave most of them in place. Once you've got 3 sides up, then you want to get some of your corners in before you place the 4th side. That's why I paused at this point, because it's harder to reach inside the box once all the sides are up to get the corners in. Whereas it's easier now for me to get in from the back here to get this corner in. So I've got these dried corner pieces. To put them in place, I'm going to put a little bit of, I'm going to make sure I choose the top that's neatest. I think that is, as opposed to that one. Put a little white icing glue at the bottom and a little bit up the sides. And then wedge that in place. And again, these were all filed so that they were the exact same height as the box sides before I started the assembly, before I started the decorating process, in fact, because if they're not, then one piece is going to be higher than the other, and that's just not going to look so good in the final construction. So that's about all I want to do. I want to make sure it's standing pretty straight up. And you'll notice there's some gap. It doesn't always fit flush to the cookie, because these are cookies. It's not an exact science. So I'm going to cover that seam with a little bit of fondant in a second. But let me get the next corner in. I want to clean up any extra icing down here as well, because that might show in the final construction. The other thing I do is I reinforce from the inside, typically now with brown icing glue, to hide the white. Now that I've got it in position, and also just to give it more structure. And this is another reason I leave the box open until the very end, is so that I can get my hand in here to reinforce these areas. And this just gives it a little more stability. And I would take a clean finger and just work that icing into the groove there, smooth it out a little bit. So let's put in the second corner, same way, and then I'm going to show you how I clean up those seams there because they are a little bit noticeable with a little bit of fondant. Okay, so the area I'm trying to cover is right in here where it's kind of a messy connection. So I've got pre-cut strips of fondant that I'm going to use to do that. I thought a lavender color would be kind of nice. And this is exactly what I've done on the other box up front. And I'm just going to sneak it into both sides of the corner. I won't need this complete length. So I'm going to cut it down a teeny bit. And to apply fondant to anything, as I did on the interior of the corners, I like to use a little bit of corn syrup as opposed to royal icing. It'll just lie flatter. And I'm going to tuck it as close to that edge as possible, cutting at the top with small scissors. And then I'll take my paring knife and just push it all the way in. Maybe even tuck it in a little bit at the bottom here. So that just neatens up that edge if it's viewed from that angle quite a lot, I think. And we'll do that on the other side as well. That's how I would finish off each corner. I've got 2 in so far. And once those 2 corners are done, I'm ready to mount the third side. It would be given a lot of drying time so that it's standing on its own. And then we'd mount the remaining 2 corners just the way I did these 2. So here's the front face I made earlier. It's relatively dry and ready to be put in place. And the other thing I've done is I've kind of marked out how far it can go over on one edge, and I'll mark it out over here. So it's roughly centered here. I also want to make sure I position it about equidistant from the edge of the cookie as I've positioned all the others, so the box is symmetrical from the top. And then it just glues down with a little bit of glue at the bottom. White glue now, because white glue will be easier to clean off if I have to. Make sure your hands are dry when you're doing this, because if they're not, they will spot the airbrush coloring. And then I need to prop this from 2 sides before I reinforce the back. So I'm putting my little food coloring containers in there. And I don't think it's big enough to reach here. Well, maybe it is. Okay, so I can prop from the outside with this as well. If it's not enough to reach, you can also use skewers. The thing I want to look at is to make sure it's not leaning too far forwards, which I think it is, which is why a skewer might be helpful, especially on this side. I also want to make sure that there's about equal spacing between here and here and here and here, so that the corners have good exposure from all angles. So I might just want to slip it this way a little bit. And then push a little bit, look at it from all sides. I think it's relatively straight up and down. So we would just leave that be to dry. Make sure it's propped from the back for maybe half an hour or so until you could safely put in these corners. I'd probably still leave the props there until all the corners were in place. That being said, I'm going to move forward and show you how to finish off the bottoms, because I've shown you how to put a side up, I've shown you how to put corners up. I want to show you how to trim out the sides. Even though this isn't completely finished, imagine all the corners in place. You just repeat this process across the entire box once everything was dry. These 3 sides are relatively intact now, or very intact, so I'm going to take out those stakes and go ahead and focus on just trimming out these 2 corners here so you can get an idea of what I do. So in the case of that box, I've got a shell border at the bottom, which is done using a star tip, a closed star tip, and I've got a number 25 in here. So the motion is pushing down, pulling back, pushing down, pulling back, pushing down, pulling back, so they overlap. And this is just going to close up this seam quite nicely. You need a relatively thick icing for this process so it holds that nice ridged shape. Pushing forward, pulling back, pushing forward, releasing pressure, pulling back, overlapping, overlapping, and so on. Do the other side. It's amazing how a little border can just clean up something that otherwise looks kind of rough. Okay, so the last touch on the base is to put a flower down to cover all this here. And I usually, again, stick it with my white icing. These are slightly bigger roses than I did last time. And I like to lay them just so they clear the notch there, so that if I do put feet on, the rose isn't gonna hit the surface of whatever I'm working on and potentially break. And now we want to fill in around the rose with some leaves. So we're back to that relatively thick icing. In my number 350, 52, 349, depending on the size of the leaf. The smaller the number, the smaller the leaf. So once you've got your sides all up and the bottom completely dry, I generally like to leave that overnight. You're ready to fill it up with cookies or optionally mount it on feet. You'll notice the box that I've got here is on its little feet. Just a couple notes about how to do that. In decorating the feet, I would keep the decoration concentrated, if there's going to be any, on the outer exposed tip of the plaque, because anything in this zone is going to cause the box to sit unlevel. So you'll notice I've just decorated the very part edge that's going to be exposed. Then arrange them in a square. Do a test setting of your box on them to make sure everything's sitting level. Remove it. Then apply a little glue, icing glue, to the ends of each foot, and then just place it on top. Allow it to rest about half an hour, and then the whole box can be picked up like so from the bottom. But again, the feet are completely optional. So now that this guy's all settled, I am going to dress it up for Mother's Day. I do like to line it with something, just a little cloth napkin or even parchment paper to cover those seams. And we do want to make sure whatever we line it with gets all the way in, because the lid needs to sit on top. And then I'm just going to fill it, because this is a pretty complicated project as it is and more of a showpiece unto itself. I'm just going to throw in a few lightweight, easy, undecorated cookies. And this is going to be my mom's Mother's Day treat. I think that's enough. Remember, this piece, even though it looks pretty sturdy and is life size, a real live box size, it is still just held together by icing and it's somewhat fragile. So I always like to have it on something as an underlying support when I'm moving it around. So that's filled up and we're ready to put the lid on. This lid was designed so that the handle actually points out to the corner, like so, rather than face forward, so that I present it kind of at an angle. And that's my beautiful 3D Mother's Day box, embellished with my prettier plaque stencils, piping, royal icing roses, contoured cookies, and lots of different techniques. Chances are I've got an in-depth video on each of those techniques, so please do check my video description for any related links to videos. All of that information will be there. If you're interested in trying other keepsake boxes for Mother's Day or any other special occasion, I've got a number of videos about those as well. Please do check out my Sugar Veil jewel box. It's gorgeous. In a previous video, I've also got a mosaic box in yet another video, and then a triple tiered box that looks like a wedding cake that's been all intricately piped with needlepoint. So till next video, live sweetly, and to all the moms out there, have a great Mother's Day.